live. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We have a real treat today. One of our co-chairs, Sara Gottwalles, is providing us a lecture. And so I'm really excited to hear about it. I think that's quite a bit of introduction already. So I'm going to turn it over to Sara.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Well, now I've got a little bit of anticipation to live up to. No pressure there. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I get into my topic, I wanted to first tell you how the committee came on the theme of freedom for this season. Last year, Dr. Paul Bartrop, who by the way is going to be speaking tomorrow night, Thursday night, don't miss that. Last time he presented a lecture on liberation and reflections by Holocaust survivors. And in this, he included a quote from a woman by the name of Hedda Margolis, who survived a death march. Hedda said, quote, "If we broke free, and then it would dawn on me. At this moment, it would take no more than a single act, a single decision to win the greatest freedom one could ever have in our age, in our corner of the world. As soon as I slipped out from under the bayonets, I would be standing outside the entire system. I might win only a few days, more likely only a few hours, but it would be a freedom millions didn't even dream about. I would belong nowhere. I would belong to nothing. No one would even know I existed. All the rules and prohibitions would no longer apply to me. I would be outside of it all. When they caught me, I would be like a wind trapped in a sail, a bird shot in flight." Isn't that incredibly powerful? It's so prolific, and it has haunted me ever since. So I just wanted to read that and share that with you today to give that quote life here again. Dr. Bartrop also said in that same lecture, in his own words this time, quote, "Death in a concentration camp needs no explanation. Survival does." That too was so prolific to me. And you know, once a student, always a student. A great professor says something and you're scribbling and scrambling to grab a piece of paper and a pen so you can take notes down. Dr. Bartrop was and always will be my mentor. So now down to brass tacks, because survival does need some explanation. People had questions for survivors after the Holocaust, possibly more now than even before, despite all of our learned knowledge since. But you know what probably needs more explanation than other subjects? The survivors who were born in Germany, males, to reputable and acceptable bloodlines and families, who had the blonde hair, had the blue eyes, and by all accounts, probably should have held that Aryan certificate. What of those young men who survived? These were visually able-bodied boys who were the poster children of the Nazi regime, in most cases, not all. Yet after the war, they were claiming to have been imprisoned and abused in Nazi concentration camps. To those whose minds do not immediately say, well, they must have been a political opponent, or perhaps they were labeled a criminal, this does need some explanation, surely. On October 14th, 1937, the Nazis set forth a decree on preventive criminal measures. This established a definition of an asocial as, quote, "someone who acts against the community, even if such actions were not criminal, but showed that he or she did not want to be part of the community." So if you exhibit free will and a desire to act outside of Nazi ordinances and expectations, there is now a preventative measure by which to deal with you. Because quickly following 1 year later in 1938, a series of decrees and regulations were created which called for the treatment of asocials, which came to be known as, quote, protective custody. This protective custody could apply to either an individual or an entire family who exhibited asocial tendencies, which caused them to be registered and placed under police surveillance. The thought process here for the Nazis was, you're not acting normal, you're not moving in step with the national community, and so you are to be watched. Just think about all of the ambiguity behind this concept of not wanting to be part of the community in Germany at this point in time. That's a very big concept. A lot of people didn't want to be part of that community. So following the timeline now, in May of 1939, the Reich Center for Combating Youth Criminality was established, and their job was to perform surveillance and begin creating files on problematic social youth, or asocial youth rather. Then 7 months later, in December of 1939, a conference was held on degenerate youth, during which Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Reich Main Security Office, called for the establishment of youth concentration camps. Heydrich looked at these prisoners as asocial youths with criminal tendencies. And as such, he involved the Institute of Criminal Biology of the Security Police because he believed that this community of alien youths, as he put it, needed to be observed as well as put through hard labor and re-education to fix this problem. These kids were problematic. So the biology side of things is coming out, and the Nazis are watching everything unfold. They're scratching their heads and they're saying, these kids should be perfect in terms of family and bloodline. But if we're trying to create the perfect Aryan race, we have to find out what is wrong with these kids so that we can continue to move in step with our goal of creating the perfect Aryan race in the future. It was unfathomable why these kids would elect to use their free will against the Fuhrer and the country. You're either with us or you are a criminal and you need to be eradicated. Several policing agencies and youth groups began to work together at this point. There was the Reich Criminal Police Office working alongside the Kripo, or as English we would say the criminal police, along with the Gestapo and the leadership of the Hitler Youth. And they were specifically weeding out young people who were deemed incapable of readmission within the national community. And as we'll see, our topic today, the camp today that I'll be talking about, was for boys specifically. And these young men had sent up red flags. They were turned in by teachers, community members, Hitler Youth leaders, judges, adults that these boys all knew and trusted, turned them in. Supposedly, these boys hung out with the wrong people. They dated the wrong girls, or they partied too hard in the discotheque. These fellows might have been bored in school. Maybe they earned poor grades or cut classes or listened to music that was deemed inappropriate. They could have gotten written up by teachers and superiors, or any number of things that a teenage boy commonly does when they're right at the cusp of manhood, that little, sense of rebellion. Mostly, these young men simply were not getting with the program. The Nazis were pushing their agenda and they were pushing it hard, and these young guys weren't having it. The steady diet and daily dose of brainwashing jargon and hate speech didn't work on these asocials. In actuality, the terms used to justify camp admission were deliberately vague. This allowed for the punishment of any behavior which was subjectively viewed as asocial or not normal for teenagers at this age, at this place, at this time. By not being specific in their terminology, the Nazis opened up the opportunity for their conspirators to continually threaten and terrorize young people in Germany. The Nazis were given the freedom to act as bullies and tyrants and as the determining figureheads of acceptable behavior. Think about how terrifyingly detrimental that is. Pure evil had the freedom to play God. So the decrees against degenerate and asocial use were all put in place, and now they were just waiting to be pushed over like a stack of dominoes. In 1940, a work camp, which had previously served as a male labor camp, then was placed as a female detention camp finally found a new form of employment as a juvenile concentration camp. Moringen Youth Protection Camp was opened in the fall of 1940 under the initiative of Reinhard Heydrich with the support of his superior, Reichswehr SS Heinrich Himmler. And Moringen was the first camp of its kind. But make no mistake, the Nazis can call it a youth protection camp all they want, but it was a juvenile concentration camp. Plain and simple here, despite all the various nomenclature. The Nazis were masters of smoke and mirrors, as we well know, and this is yet another example of that behavior. The camp was led by SS Major Karl Dieter, and SS Death's Head Guards were in the camp as well, and Waffen SS trainers oversaw the boys. The average ages of prisoners was between 16 to 22, though I have seen some records that say that there were prisoners as young as 13 registered to the camp. Prisoners' days began at 5:15 in the morning in the summer or 5:45 in the morning in the winter, and they were typically forced to work 10 hours each day of hard labor. This was viewed as a valuable educational method for growing boys. Work within the camp included things like saddlery, knitting mills, weaving mills, gluing paper bags together, bookbinding, and tailoring and painting. Boys made things like overalls and string and towels. They produced cartridges and cartridge holders for armaments for the German army, or they worked on the farms or the sugar mills at Norton-Hardenberg. Hard labor detachments were more common than those aforementioned camp workshops. Hard labor jobs included things like carrying bags of cement weighing upwards of 110 pounds from the local cement manufacturing plant, working on construction sites or in stone quarries, and digging trenches to lay cable for the German Postal Service. That's just to name a few of the more physically grueling tasks that these young men were assigned. Armament industries also produced the greatest pay and kickback to the SS by using youth slave labor. So the boys were sent to work in armament factories such as the Army Ammunition Institute, or MUNA, as it was known then. It was a former salt mine where they produced armaments. Boys were also sent to work at the Pillar Company, which set up a specific branch in Moringen so that the company could take advantage of this youth slave labor at the time. Pillar manufactures compressors and blowers. They're still around. Truthfully, this was all slave labor because any pay that was promised to the inmates never came to fruition. The boys never saw a cent. For character education, or I laugh because it's re-education, as you and I would say, prisoners were subjected to military drills by SS trainers of the Waffen SS, the Waffen SS being the military and the combat branch within the SS. And these drills were dubbed community training. The purpose of character education is listed as focusing on order, punctuality, cleanliness, discipline, and above all else, work. Punishments were swift and severe in Moringen. As we know, one could become a victim of this camp for any number of illogical accusations, so it should really come as no surprise that accusations of wrongdoing were just as illogical and random. From being accused to lounging around during work times to not making your bed properly, inmates would need to be corrected of these criminal ways. Common punishments reported by survivors included things like withholding meals, or forcing inmates to eat while standing up. They were forced to sleep on the boards of their bed without a mattress or straw. Withholding male privileges was practiced. Boys could be forced to run until they collapsed with the threat of being shot the entire time. Discipline exercises to the point of collapse. They were whipped. They were beaten with billy clubs. The list goes on and on. Physical and psychological punishments were all employed at Moringen at this concentration camp. I'm not going to say youth protection camp. It's a concentration camp. But treatment and punishment at Moringen went beyond this. Because the camp was broken down into at least 8 blocks, each with SS supervision. There was the observation block, the block for the unfit or incompetent, the block of disturbers or troublemakers, the block of total or permanent failures, the block of occasional failures, the block of those who were questionably capable of re-education, the block of persons who were deemed capable of re-education, as well as a Gestapo block, which housed politically oppositionally classified young people, typically foreign youth, as well as the swing kids demographic. So once again, the Nazis are given absolute freedom within this lack of specificity. What exactly does it mean to be a permanent versus an occasional failure? What is unfit? What is a disturber? And how is one labeled questionably capable of education? The man with the answers to these questions was Dr. Robert Ritter. Ritter was a German racial scientist. An interesting point, even though he was not registered as an official member of the Nazi Party, he did hold the position of a child psychologist for the Hitler Youth. So in 1936, he was appointed to the head of the Racial Hygiene and Demographic Biology Research Unit of the Criminal Police. You may have heard of Ritter before. He heavily influenced pseudoscientific thoughts behind what he called disguised mental retardation, as well as being one of the main proponents for establishing gypsy classification. The gypsy classification work is, if you want to call it work, what he did is probably what he's best known for. All he claimed that he did was pivotal to German racial purity. The Criminal Biological Institute of Reich Security Police actually opened a department within the camp in 1941, and Ritter set up shop. Here, he was able to use inmates as guinea pigs for his studies to develop a racial hygiene campaign against criminals. Ritter claimed that what he called disguised mental retardation presented itself in children through cunning behavior, quick talking, over-independence, masked cleverness, and overall criminal tendencies. He claimed that these criminally labeled asocial youngsters were not only unfit for general community within Nazi Germany, due to their criminal behavior, they were unfit. But now he's tagging these kids with a biological condition, making them doubly unfit for German society at this time. These youths are a criminal biological terror, and preventative measures must be taken to control them and others like them. That's the message here. So as such, Moringen became the first juvenile camp where prisoners were assigned to barracks based on their biological characteristics, according to Ritter's racial hygiene theory. He developed classification guidelines based on genealogical, moral, and medical characteristics to dictate these barrack assignments. All new inmates went through the observation block, where they spent about 6 months being observed by Ritter and his assistant, Eva Justin. Prisoners were then assigned to their block, where they would undergo training and education to see if movement could be permitted within the block system. If a prisoner was deemed to be questionably capable of education, they would be sent to F block, run through the military drills and all of the labor, then reassigned to E block for persons capable of education and released, usually into military service. About 25% of inmates made up that group. Prisoners who showed what Ritter called character deficiencies, such as a lack of motivation, a learning disability, or the inability to pass proficiency testing, they were sent to D block for permanent failures. About 10 to 15% of inmates were sent there. Irresponsible, unpredictable, unstable inmates who showed a lack of independence, they made up about 10 to 15%, and they were sent to G block for occasional failures. And 10% were labeled troublemakers and sent to S block. The breakdown of grouping continues on, but the unspecified percentage of prisoners deemed unfit and incompetent from U Block were forcibly sterilized and sent to concentration camps upon their 18th birthday. So I'd like to interject a little bit more here about the Gestapo block quickly. The block was not only for foreign youths, that being youths who were from countries outside of Poland or other than Poland. They were rounded up by the Gestapo, but the Gestapo block also housed alleged swing kid members. Since March of 1940, Himmler had spoken with Heydrich about their shared concern for juvenile delinquency within the German youth population. Then on January 2nd, 1942, Himmler wrote to Heydrich to clamp down on the swing movement members and leaders. So after this exchange, we see a greater amount of numbers of youths who were sent belonging to that subculture group to these youth camps, especially Moringen. About 70 kids alone were sent from Hamburg. Some survivor accounts that I've come across are from swing kids, like Gunther Discher, and he was known as the oldest jazz DJ in Germany up to his death in 2012. Typically, girls were sent to Uckermark, right near Ravensbrück, and the boys were sent to Moringen. Nearly 3,000 children over the age of 10 were deported to these camps from all parts of Germany between 1940 and 1945. There was a third juvenile camp named Lichtmannstadt, which was specifically placed for Polish juvenile prisoners, but this research is not including statistics from that particular camp today. Records show approximately 1,500 male youths as having entered Moringen. Little medical attention was given at Moringen. The diet was comparative to other concentration camps within the Nazi system. Coffee substitute and bread with maybe a little bit of jam was given in the morning. And then lunch and dinner consisted of a thin, watery soup made of some root vegetable. 4 deaths were reported from malnutrition, which is unusual. Usually the Nazis didn't label malnutrition, especially within camps in Germany. Truly, life in Moringen all depended on the block to which you were assigned. If you were deemed capable of rehabilitation and re-education, you would go through the drills, the hard labor, and just perhaps be freed after a few months or a few years of time served. But the alternatives were made well known to the inmates, according to survivors. The psychological terror was just as intense as the physical abuses that these kids faced. For those who were diagnosed as incapable of becoming a value member of pure German society, they would be deported to asylums, extermination camps, and sterilized. Yes, they were sterilized. July 14th, 1933, the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring was passed just months after Hitler seized power. The law was fully put into action on January 1st, 1934. And the law stated that forced sterilization was necessary to protect future generations. Now, the research on youth camps is particularly lacking, and Moringen has honestly only really been studied since the early 90s, 1993 specifically. The studies are slowly rising and coming together. Thus, this particular research presentation currently lacks some information, such as how these sterilizations were actually conducted on these boys, whether there were actual vasectomy operations, or if drugs were injected, or if Heinrich Himmler's preference of a quicker mass sterilization operation utilizing hidden secret X-rays was utilized. That information, if available, is yet to be uncovered. More research needs to be done, and believe you me, I'm just scratching the surface here today. As I say, youth camps within Germany have been overlooked a great deal, but now I'm a dog with a bone. I'm all over this. So that said, I do feel confident putting forth this contention, and that is execution and sterilization was the Nazi answer to absolute racial German purity. During the T4 pogrom beginning in 1939, sterilizations was deemed compulsory. within hereditary mental and physical conditions. And by the way, 300,000 people were murdered during the T4 pogrom. Poof, 300,000 people just gone. Between 1933 and 1939, it's estimated that 360,000 people were sterilized under the law for prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. 360,000 people were sterilized because of this law that we know of on record. It only makes sense with that information that the Nazis would feel confident in adding to that number from 1940 till 1945 as they continued to conduct sterilization procedures on these young men deemed asocials, a criminal menace, and a biological abnormality. They were life unworthy of life, lebensunwertes, as the Nazis would have said. Their bloodline was to be stamped out. These young men needed to be incapable of creating future life. The racial hygienic blight on Germany was to be prevented case by case and boy by boy. And behind those camp walls, designed for the evil pleasure and freedom to torture, terrorize, and traumatize, Nazi SS guards and Nazi doctors could do as they pleased. And they did. Maybe they were the ones who were subhuman. Dr. Ritter believed that criminal biological markers were hereditary, just as his supposed disguised mental retardation theory. I really hate saying that, by the way, if you can't tell. He said that sterilization was the means to an end for these problematic German youths. The freedom to father children, to watch them grow and share with them the strength of their moral values, to stand up and question that which they knew to be wrong was robbed from these young men. And sticking by their morals didn't just prevent these kids from creating future life. Sometimes it cost them their own life. At 17 years old, Jonathan Stark was fired from his job due to his religion. He was a Jehovah's Witness. He was conscripted for Reich labor in October of 1943, but he refused to take the oath to Hitler and the oath to state. So he was sent to Stuttgart prison, and then he was transferred to Moringen, where he became inmate number 1140. Finally, he was sent to Sachsenhausen after he was deemed incapable of re-education at Moringen. Stark was sent to Sachsenhausen, where he was hanged on November 1st, 1944. He was 18 years old. His freedom to practice his religion in peace with respect permanently extinguished. He refused to bow or break, refused to place his faith in Hitler above his faith in God. And so they murdered him. Moringen destroyed lives, whether it was right there in the camp, later through surveillance, being sent to a concentration camp or an extermination camp, or through unwavering psychological warfare. Survivor Friedrich Lasker said, quote, "I could not go to sleep in peace if I didn't know that what happened once would never happen again." Lasker was sent to Moringen because he was deemed a half-Jew who fell in love with an Aryan girl. Moringen stripped these youths of their freedom to be young, to make their own decisions, and to experience their own typical teenage rebellions. They couldn't date whom they wished, listen to the music that moved them, dance freely as they wanted, or even simply be a poor student in a subject. And worse yet, they were stripped of their freedom to express their young wisdom in disagreeing with a regime that they knew should have no right to infringe upon anyone's right to life. Qualities that we now celebrate and encourage in our youngsters sent these kids to juvenile detention camps. April 9th, 1945, the US Army liberated Moringen. 1,500 boys had been registered to the camp. 56 died, succumbing to malnourishment, labor detachment deaths, or they were murdered while they tried to escape. But the numbers with deaths are a little bit shaky at Moringen for me. And as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum notes, the number of prisoners who contracted tuberculosis and were subsequently sent to the Benninghausen Institute, that number needs to be located and added to the death count here, because surely those poor souls also died a horrific, painful death. Nazi doctors conducted loads of tuberculosis experiments, and it pretty much ensured the death of these young patients, to be certain. But that's a whole other can of worms. The Moringen site was reused as a displaced persons camp for the Polish people. Then in 1948, it became a provincial clinic. Today, there's a Holocaust memorial house in Moringen, and it was established in 1993, and it shows a permanent exhibit. The exhibit at Moringen and Ravensbrück memorials is aptly named "We Had Just Begun to Live," to which I pay honor with the title of my presentation, "We Had Just Begun to Live." The chilling realization is this: if the Nazis were willing to do this to their own children, if they were willing to beat, starve, psychologically traumatize, sterilize, and murder their asocial German-born babies, then truly, what was to stop them from sending all of the children deemed undesirable to the experimentations, to the torture, to the Einsatzgruppen pits, the gas, and the chimneys? If there's one bright point that can be taken away, perhaps it's this: that hopefully you and I, all of us, we would hold the Nazi label of asocial and fight for our freedom to live. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sara. That was such a wonderful presentation. And although I know that very little is known at the moment with your research, how do you intend on continuing your research efforts in this area?
There's a lot that needs to be uncovered. I need to get in touch with the Moringa Memorial House for certain. And I have the names of some survivors. I'm going to have to get in touch with them and say, I need information on this person, this person, this person, because they say that's the best way to contact them. Nothing's really digitized yet. I checked all of their records. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has a little bit in their encyclopedias. I laugh because they have 4 volumes of concentration camps and ghettos, but there were, I believe, 40,000 concentration camps within the Nazi system. So yeah, you would need a few volumes to cover all of that information. It's really just a matter of, trying to scour and get more and more information. I need to do a little bit more digging into some of the research documents for Dr. Ritter, apparently. But the thing that really drives me crazy is I suspect very strongly, based on other projects that I've looked at, because this is dealing with German children, they don't want all of the facts out there. I'm not sure that all of the records would have been kept as closely on these children as, say, the Jewish children, all of the other groups that were deemed, inappropriate or unworthy of life by the Nazis. They were proud of what they were doing there. This, I kind of wonder if it was kind of slipped under the rug, almost like the T4 pogrom was, where we're doing this to our own population, which shows, how pure evil we are if we're willing to do this to our own. But it's going to take a lot more digging, a lot more time. When I first decided to do this project and present for this season, I thought, oh, this will be interesting. I'll be able to find some good information, put together a nice little presentation. And then the more I dug, the more my jaw kept dropping. Like, oh, I can't cover all of this in a matter of 3 months. This is going to take, more like 3 years and a lot of putting my nose to the grindstone. So, and I apologize too for not doing my usual slideshow presentation. Usually I love to put up PowerPoints and all, but there aren't that many pictures. And I thought it might be a little bit boring if I just put up all of the Nazi documents over and over of what they had. Who wants to see that? That was just, the Nazi documents saying this is good. That's I don't want to give that lip service and show that, but it is gonna take a little bit more work, and I'm excited about it. It's daunting, but I'm very excited about it. Yeah. Thank you for that. It's a good question.
And pulling in our questions from the chat, we have, how is this camp, this juvenile concentration camp, different than the other concentration camps?
The way that these boys were treated was not quite as severe, from what I've been able to tell, as far as the typical treatment that you hear from the camp where a Jewish person would have lived and experienced. I think that there was a little bit more recognition of, we want to keep these boys alive and hopefully we can re-educate them. We don't want to necessarily work them absolutely to death. We want to work them hard because we believe that that's an important value to creating strong German men. And that was the whole thing. Was with this camp, it was about re-education and reforming the brain and saying, okay, you should be perfect, but you're not, because you're not buying into the ideology. If we pound it into your head and force you to believe it, then we'll let you live. With other concentration camps where you had the population that was deemed unfit and undesirable, there wasn't that kind of care, and if someone quite frankly dies, we can replace you. That was the view there. I think that there was a little bit more action to try to keep these boys alive. We want to work the hell out of you, but we don't want to kill you in the process. Hopefully that answers the question there. Also, with not killing the boys on site deliberately, if you were deemed incapable of re-education, you were sent to a concentration camp and hanged, or an extermination camp. You could be shot, you could be hanged, you could possibly have been sent to the gas chamber. Maybe that's part of the research that I need to uncover, what would have happened there. But that's the biggest difference that I'm seeing. Good question. Thank you for that.
A comment was very interesting to learn about this camp. I didn't hear much about it before. Very powerful speech, and loved the beginning of the lecture too. Another comment is, bravo, Fave's statement was about the guards. Maybe they were inhuman. Not sure I got that correct, but close. Your delivery was emotional and touching. I know while listening to this speech, it kind of reminded me to some degree about the movie Jojo Rabbit. Although there wasn't shown in that film the youth being sent to such a camp for re-education, the amount of potential brainwashing was very apparent within that film.
Absolutely. For those of you who aren't familiar, really, it's about a little boy who's in the Hitler Youth. So where this kind of takes off from that is, if you're familiar with Jojo Rabbit, if you're familiar with the pageantry of the Hitler Youth, it's rah, 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 Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts of Germany trying to, be in part of this, I hate to say it, but Hitler mania. This was Hitler mania. Get behind him, support him. You're giving your life. You're willing to sacrifice everything, including your life, to Hitler. Isn't it wonderful? And they're brainwashing these children. It was compulsory at the age of 10. So these were the kids, these were the boys in this instance, who were standing there saying, what? Why are we doing this? Throw the grenade. What? No, I don't want to do this. And then they were turned in by their Hitler Youth leader of, well, they're not getting with it, so let's re-educate. What I would really love to find are stories of people who reacted the way that I would have reacted. Of, if I were sent to Moringen, I would say, you want me to what? Oh, yes, absolutely. And then I would have been released and hightailed it the heck out of there and started moving my own resistance movement underground and said, look, they're not going to catch me this time. Now I know how to be a little bit more slick. You thought I was a criminal before? Ooh, I'm a criminal now. And as for the question of saying, or the comment, thank you for that, of saying that you hadn't heard of this camp prior. Neither had I. I was looking at a website that I'm pretty convinced was like the 5th website that ever existed. It looked that old. And I was looking for something dealing with Hungary at the time. And somehow I fell upon, it was late at night. You know what happens when you're looking at the internet, searching the internet late at night. And I fell into this category that was dealing with lesser known concentration camps. And it was almost like I was looking at like an index card, and it just said Moringen, the location in Germany, and that it was a juvenile youth detention center. And then below it, it said youth protection camp. And then below that, it said youth concentration camp. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, to me, that quantifies as three very different things. I want to know more about this. And that's how this all kind of began. So thank you. Thank you all for your comments. It's very helpful, very kind.
And then additionally, I can picture what happened at the camp in my mind. This one affected more of the youth. Very sad that it happened to the boys. And also a follow-up that you did answer the question. Any other questions, comments that you have for Professor Gottwalles? I know we could probably continue talking and expanding on more of the history. I mean, to me, it's very interesting because these boys, these young men, these youth weren't necessarily being exterminated at this location, but being shipped out to the other concentration and extermination camps. And I'm wondering if they were recorded for that, but how would they be designated, you know, like in those records sort of thing? Were there good records? I mean, as you were mentioning, the Germans, or the Nazis rather, may have destroyed many of the records stemming from this particular location. So
absolutely. Yeah, I think that a lot of the records for Moringen itself would have been destroyed, but you bring up a very good point. And I'm thinking like with Jonathan's case, who was murdered at Stuttgart, he would have been listed as a Jehovah's Witness. So he would have fallen into the Jehovah's Witness. For these other boys who were sent, they probably would have been labeled criminals or political opponent, probably criminal, and exterminated that way and added into the criminal population that was killed at these various concentration and extermination camps. Absolutely. I have to say too, I was thinking last night, oh, I can't wait to dig more into Moringen. And then I started thinking, what about Ravensbrück? What about Uckermark, right outside of Ravensbrück, where the girls were sent? And in terms of the kids being sterilized, that's going to be really hard. Like I'm going to have to emotionally prep myself for that, because if anyone's familiar, typically what was done to sterilize young women at the time was they would, as far as I understand, they would inject like a form of rubber cement into your uterus. So that's terrifying and very disturbing. And everything hits different now that I'm a mom. You know, I used to be able to read this stuff and be like, oh, that's terrible. But now that I have a daughter, it's just, it's intense. It hits even harder. And I need a little bit more time to recoup myself, you know. But this is a bigger project, you know, and especially then I've got to look into the Polish youth camp as well. So what I thought was going to be just a nice, well put together presentation with a little red bow has turned into just, you know, a newspaper wrapping with a bunch of things hanging off the side, a lot of tape, you know, a lot of stuff that I've made a lot of work for myself, and I'm up for it. I'm excited. Historians love this. Researchers love this kind of stuff.
I can only imagine your office as being one of those cork boards with the thousands of yarn connecting with thumbtacks with news clippings and other objects. I know typically your computer screen is very littered with post-it notes, but I imagine that, you know, the yarn situation may be going on somewhere within your home.
My legal pad situation is getting a little out of control. So yeah, the yarn's going to have to come out soon. Thank you everyone so much for your time. I really appreciate your questions and your comments. And Stephen, thank you so much for moderating for me and for speaking with me and letting me nerd out a little bit with you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for presenting today. Let me pull up the schedule real quick to see what our next event is to
Continue to
prepare
attend,
for.
continue to attend all of these panels. And if you can't attend a panel right then, keep in mind that we're recording these and they're going to be on YouTube. So check it out.
It appears our next one is our first hybrid event. The YouTube live and or Lee campus in J103 music presentation, Music of the Holocaust, presented by and played by Professor Rachel Cox and Professor Mary Seal. So stay tuned for that. That's at 1 o'clock today. And yes,
They
all
do
of
beautiful
these
work.
are available right after we end the stream. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.